The Skraith died badly, the way all of them did, not in a single moment but in stages, like a building collapsing floor by floor. Axon had seen it 100 times. The carapace fractures first, that blue-black shell splitting along stress lines that ran from shoulder to sternum, releasing the pressurized fluid underneath in thin, hissing jets that smelled of copper and ammonia. Then the secondary respiratory system fails, and they make that sound, that specific, involuntary sound that Axon had never been able to describe to anyone who hadn't heard it, somewhere between a sustained chord and a scream, produced not by a mouth but by the collapse of internal membranes vibrating on their way down. Then the eyes go last. Always the eyes. 4 of them, arranged in a shallow arc across the forehead, dimming in sequence from outermost to innermost, like lights being switched off in a hallway. This one dimmed slowly. Axon knelt in the rubble of what had been a refueling platform on the outer edge of Skraith Station, the battle still raging 40 meters above him through 3 collapsed levels of durasteel and carbon foam. He could hear his own team, Sergeant Voss shouting coordinates, Pritchard's railgun cycling through its thermal pause, the collective chaos of a firefight that had stopped making tactical sense 20 minutes ago and become something more primitive and exhaustive. He should have been up there. He knew that. His left arm was cut along the forearm where a Skraith blade had clipped him during the breach, shallow enough to ignore but deep enough to remind him with every heartbeat that he was present, that he was physical, that he occupied a body that could be opened. He had stopped because the Skraith grabbed him. Not with aggression. That was what stopped him first, the quality of the grip, fingers closing around his wrist with something that felt nothing like combat. More like a hand reaching through water. Axon had spun with his weapon already raised, and the dying soldier had looked up at him with 3 of its 4 eyes already dark, and the 4th still holding something. Recognition, maybe. Something worse than recognition. It spoke in standard. Most of them didn't bother. The ones who knew it used it for taunts, for psychological operations, for the particular cruelties that required a shared language. This one used it carefully, the way someone uses a language they learned not from birth but from study, every syllable weighted with the effort of translation. "We made you first." 4 words. Axon stood over the body for 11 seconds. He counted them without meaning to, the way he always counted things, the way he had always assumed was a quirk, before the 4th eye went dark and the Skraith was simply dead, like all the others, like all the ones before. "We made you first." He straightened. His arm bled. Above him, the firefight resolved itself with the sound of Voss calling clear, and Pritchard responding, and the particular post-combat silence that followed. The silence that was never truly silent but was simply the absence of directed noise, everything ambient and unintentional. Axon climbed back up through the collapsed levels and said nothing to anyone about what he had heard. He said nothing for 3 days. They processed back through the Skraith Station medical bay, through debrief, through the particular administrative machinery of a military that needed every engagement catalogued, quantified, and stored. Axon sat in chairs and answered questions and let medics seal his arm and ate the food put in front of him and slept in his bunk in the way he always slept. Not deeply, not fully, some part of him always slightly awake, which he had always attributed to training, to discipline, to the kind of combat readiness they had built into him from the beginning. Had they? Or had something else? He didn't sleep on the 3rd night. He lay in his bunk and stared at the bunk above him and thought about what he knew. What he actually knew, not what he had been told. The distinction had never felt urgent before. Now it was the only distinction that mattered. What he knew, his designation was Axon, Project Series 7, a classified joint military bioengineering program that had begun 14 years ago when the Skraith War was still being called a border conflict. He knew that he had been assembled. That word had always appeared in his own internal vocabulary. Assembled, never born, using human neural architecture as the primary cognitive substrate, with Skraith physiological modifications applied at the genomic level to produce a body that could operate in Skraith environments, read Skraith biological signals, pass at close but not too close range as something not entirely human. He knew that he was the only successful product of Project 7. He knew that 6 years ago they had activated him, briefed him, equipped him, and sent him to war against the people, the species, whose biology ran in his cells. What he had been told, that this had been humanity's idea. Human science. Human ingenuity. A weapon grown in human labs from human genius and Skraith DNA harvested from battlefield casualties, stitched together by human hands into something unprecedented. "We made you first." He got up at 0300 and went to the communications bay and accessed the mission archive for the Skraith station engagement and pulled the file on the Skraith soldier he had knelt beside. Unit designation, battlefield photographs, the brief taxonomic notation that military intelligence attached to every confirmed kill. He read the notation 3 times. The soldier had been flagged before the engagement, not as a combatant but as an operative, a Skraith intelligence officer embedded in a forward unit. Someone who would know things. Someone who had been sent there knowing things. Someone who had looked at Axon across a collapsed floor and said, "We made you first not as a dying curse or a psychological gambit, but as information. A specific delivery to a specific recipient." As if the message had been waiting for the right moment, the right face, the right pair of eyes to receive it. Axon closed the file. He pulled up his own service record next, out of habit, out of the same impulse that makes a person check a wound they already know is there. Project 7 documentation, classified at Tier 5, accessible only to officers of command rank or above. Which meant his own file, the original file, the creation file, the document that answered the question of what he actually was and where he had actually come from, was stored somewhere he had never been permitted to go. He knew where. He had always known where, in the background way that he knew many things that no one had explicitly told him. Veritech Station. A research installation so far out of primary space lanes that it appeared on navigational charts as a footnote, a dead-end coordinate marked with a military notation for restricted access. He had seen it referenced obliquely in documents. He had never questioned why he knew it. He was questioning now. He accessed the hangar manifest, found a reconnaissance vessel scheduled for maintenance rotation that wouldn't be missed for at least 30 hours, memorized the guard cycle, and went back to his bunk to wait for 0500. He took nothing personal because he owned nothing personal. He had never found that strange until now. He stole the ship cleanly. There was no other word for it. He moved through the maintenance level with a confidence that was not performed but instinctual, as if he had walked those corridors in some other iteration of himself, and the one guard who might have been a problem made the mistake of being turned the wrong direction for 40 seconds, and then Axon was in the vessel, and the vessel was in space, and Skraith Station was a diminishing shape in the aft display. The ship was a Harrier-class recon vessel, single pilot, fast, cramped in the way of things designed for function rather than occupancy, with a cockpit that smelled of recycled air and old machinery and the particular absence of personality that military vehicles had, stripped of anything that wasn't load-bearing. Axon had piloted Harriers before, dozens of times. He settled into the seat and ran the calculations for Veritech Station and felt, in the part of himself that was always slightly awake, that this was correct. That this direction was the correct direction. He did not know whether to find that comforting or terrifying. He was 40 minutes into the transit when the communication channel opened. Project 7. Not his name. His designation, spoken by a voice he knew, Commander Rail, head of the 7th Division Strategic Operations, a man with a face like compressed stone and a manner to match. Terminate current heading and return to Skraith Station. This is your one non-escalated instruction. Axon said nothing for a moment. Then, who authorized Project 7, Commander? Silence. Then, that question is above your clearance level. I'm aware. That's why I'm asking. He paused. Was it us? Specifically, was Project 7 a human initiative? Another silence, longer, with a different quality. The quality of a man choosing what to say very carefully. Return to Skraith Station. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get from me. The next contact you receive will not be from me. The channel closed. Axon looked at the stars through the forward viewport and thought, that is not how an innocent man answers a question. An innocent man, a man with nothing to hide, a man who could answer without consequence, says yes without the pause. The pause was the answer. The pause was a room with something in it. He increased speed and watched Skraith Station's signal disappear from his tracking display. The first pursuit ship appeared 17 minutes later. A Lancer-class interceptor, military-grade, running without identifier codes, which told him everything he needed to know about the official posture of this engagement. Nothing officially happening here. Nothing to explain later. He watched it resolve on the tracking display from a sensor ghost into a solid contact, moving fast, moving with purpose, angling for an intercept trajectory that would cut him off from the primary transit lane in approximately 8 minutes. Axon did not panic. He identified this absence of panic as significant, not as a sign of courage but as a data point. He had been in combat for 6 years and had developed, he'd always assumed, the professional's useful detachment from immediate fear. But this felt different. It felt like something operating underneath the level of fear. Something that recognized the geometry of pursuit and began, without his active instruction, calculating angles and options and blind spots with a speed and completeness that outpaced anything he'd been explicitly trained to do. Who built that in? He broke left and dived along the solar plane, using the star's interference field to mud his drive signature, a maneuver that took the Lancer by surprise and bought him 60 seconds of repositioning. The Harrier was slower overall but more maneuverable in close geometry, better at the tight angular reversals that interceptors were designed to close down. He used that, pulling a sequence of course changes that were less planned than intuited, each one arriving in his hands before it arrived in his conscious mind, a piloting instinct that had always existed but had never before alarmed him. A second contact appeared on the tracking display. Then a third, this one from a different vector. They had anticipated his dive, had seeded the field, were running a compression approach designed to eliminate his angular options one by one until the only remaining trajectory was backward, toward Kara Station, toward custody, toward whatever version of. A debrief would explain why Project 7 had been reclassified from asset to liability between one day and the next. He needed a gap. He calculated the geometry of the 3 pursuers and found it, not a gap exactly but an asymmetry, a 15-second window between the second and third interceptors' overlapping arcs where their combined sensor coverage briefly thinned along a specific vector, a vector that led toward an asteroid field called the Veritas Scatter, 2 light-minutes distant, catalogued in military navigation charts as navigable but inadvisable, which was military language for we don't chase you in there. He aimed for it. The second interceptor opened fire as he turned, not at him directly but ahead of him, laying suppressive fire across the vector he'd chosen, trying to force him to redirect. He didn't redirect. He altered his angle by 11 degrees and went through the suppressive fire at maximum speed, and 2 of the energy bolts passed close enough that he felt them in the hull, a shuddering vibration transmitted through the seat and into his spine, and he was in the scatter and the interceptors were behind him and the rock and the interference were between them. He flew into the scatter's interior darkness and breathed. The Veritas Scatter was old rock, fragments of something that had been a planet once, or perhaps had never achieved it, mass that had been trying to cohere for 1 billion years and had given up, settling for proximity instead of union, a civilization of stone too stubborn to combine and too dense to disperse. The Harrier's navigation system registered it as 12,000-plus individual contacts of varying size, and Axon flew between them the way he had always flown, which was to say without complete reliance on the instruments, using something that registered in his processing as an enhanced spatial awareness, a sense of where the gaps were before the sensors fully confirmed them. He had told himself for 6 years that this was a product of training, of repetition, of the extraordinary hours the military had invested in making him into something precise and formidable. He was no longer confident of that. He flew deeper into the scatter and followed the geometry of the field toward the far edge, where the rocks thinned and the transit lane to the outer sectors opened, the long road toward Veritech Station. The interceptors had not followed him in. He could see their signals at the field's edge on the tracking display, holding position, communicating with each other and, he suspected, with someone further up the command chain. Someone who was deciding things about him right now in a room he would never see. A different signal appeared. Not military. The IFF code, identification friend or foe, returned something he didn't immediately recognize, and then, after 2 seconds of cross-referencing the navigation database, recognized as Skraith. Not a military vessel. A smaller class, something that corresponded roughly to what humans would call a fast courier, a ship built for speed and information carrying, not combat. It was sitting at a position 7 kilometers into the scatter, motionless, as if it had been waiting. Axon's hand moved to the weapons control before he consciously decided to reach for it. Then stopped. The Skraith ship broadcast a narrow signal on a frequency he recognized not from training but from somewhere else, somewhere prior, somewhere he had no authorized memory of, and the signal was 3 repeating tones that resolved in his auditory processing into something that wasn't quite language and wasn't quite music but communicated, with complete unmistakable clarity, a single concept. We know where you're going, and we want the same thing. Axon sat with his hand above the weapons control for a long time. The signal repeated. He left the weapons alone and flew past the Skraith ship without contact, watching it in the aft display until the scatter's interior geometry swallowed it. It didn't follow him. He wasn't sure if that was reassuring or more frightening than pursuit would have been. He emerged from the scatter's far edge and entered the transit lane and set his course for the outer sectors and sat with the question of how he had understood those tones. How he had understood those tones. For the next 6 hours of flight, during which he did not sleep, because the part of himself that was always slightly awake had become, tonight, entirely awake. Veritech Station was not impressive from the outside, which was by design. Military research installations that wanted to stay unnoticed did not build themselves to look significant. It was a hub-and-spoke configuration, 4 research modules arranged around a central processing core, the whole thing painted in the non-reflective dark that made it disappear against the starfield at anything beyond medium range. No running lights beyond the minimum navigation requirement. No communication signals beyond the maintenance ping. A place that wanted to appear, from a distance, like something almost not there. But it was there, and Axon had confirmed it on the tracking display 3 hours out, and spent those 3 hours reading everything the Harrier's navigation system had on the installation, which was almost nothing, which was itself informative, and thinking about how you infiltrated a station that had been built by people who had also built you. He knew his own capabilities better than anyone. He also knew that the people at Veritech Station knew his capabilities better than anyone. That was the paradox. His greatest advantage was himself. His greatest vulnerability was that the people he was moving against had invented that self and could, presumably, anticipate it. He came in from below the ecliptic, the direction that any conventional threat assessment would rate as least likely because approach from below offered the poorest retreat geometry. Axon rated retreat geometry as currently irrelevant. He wasn't planning to retreat. At 50 kilometers he killed the drive and let the Harrier coast, invisible at that distance to anything but a dedicated active scan, and Veritech wasn't running active scans, because running active scans announced your position the way a lighthouse announces a coast. He suited up in the EVA gear stored in the Harrier's emergency locker and prepared the entry sequence he had been developing in his mind for 3 hours, which was not a plan exactly but a series of conditional responses, a tree of if-then decisions that branched from each other depending on what he found. At 5 kilometers he deployed, a single suited figure in the dark between a hidden ship and a hidden station, moving on a trajectory that the laws of physics would carry to completion without any further propulsion expenditure that might show on sensors. He was a rock among rocks, moving at the speed of intention. He hit the station's outer hull at what he had calculated would be a maintenance access point, a service hatch on the module designated in the navigation database as Research Block C, which cross-referenced with enough classified project numbers that it seemed the correct place to start. The magnetic adhesion in his suit's palms engaged against the hull, and he moved across it the way certain creatures move across surfaces, the way he had always been able to move across surfaces in EVA operations, with a sureness that other operators had always admired and attributed to training. He was done attributing things to training. The hatch responded to a maintenance override code that he had not been issued and had not stolen but had, when he stood at the hatch and allowed some part of him to consider the mechanism, simply known. A code that lived not in his trained memory but in a different layer. Deeper. Older. He entered it without hesitation, and the hatch opened, and he went inside. Veritech Station was occupied. That was the first thing he established after cycling through the airlock and removing his EVA helmet. The environmental systems were running at occupancy levels, temperature and atmospheric pressure calibrated for inhabited spaces, and the air, he breathed it and registered, in the part of him that read biological signals. At least 11 distinct human biological presences distributed across the station's modules. 11 people working in a classified research installation at the edge of explored space, which suggested either an active project or a project that had never truly concluded. He moved through the maintenance corridors, the secondary passageways behind the main research halls, accessible through the panels that lined every wall and that he identified immediately, without searching, which unsettled him and which he noted and set aside and continued moving. The station's interior smelled of laboratory, of the specific chemical absence that air filtration produces in enclosed scientific spaces, of something that was not quite biological but adjacent to it. He followed the smell of that adjacency the way a person follows something familiar before they know why it's familiar. He heard voices. 2 of them, in a room beyond a maintenance panel, speaking in the careful, focused way of people discussing something they considered important. He stilled himself against the corridor wall and listened and heard words that assembled themselves into meaning with a terrible clarity. The activation window, the biological clock, the secondary genomic sequence that nobody had been able to predict the triggering mechanism for until now. Words that could have been about anything and that he knew, with a certainty that lived in the same layer as the maintenance codes and the navigation instincts, were about him. He pulled the panel back and entered the room from behind, and two researchers, a woman in her 50s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been working on a problem for longer than a decade, and a younger man still holding a data tablet like a shield, looked at him with the expressions of people who had been expecting something and were still surprised by what arrived. "Axon," the woman said. "Dr. Marin Voss." He knew her face from somewhere he had no official access to. She did not seem surprised that he knew her name when he said it. "Sit down. Where are my files?" "Sit down," she said again, not unkindly, "and I'll tell you what you need to know before you read anything. There are things your system will need preparation for before." "That sounds," Axon said, "like something someone says when they want to control what I understand before I understand it." She looked at him for a long moment. The younger researcher had not moved or spoken. "That's fair," she said finally. "That's actually completely fair." She gestured at the chair and sat in her own. "Then let me ask you something first. Have you experienced anything unusual in the last 72 hours? Physically. Not psychologically, physically." He thought of the tones from the Skraith ship, the way they had resolved in his auditory processing into meaning. "What would unusual look like?" he said. She looked at the younger researcher. The younger researcher looked at the tablet he was holding as if he would prefer to be somewhere else. "Activation," she said. "The secondary genomic sequence, the Skraith contribution to your physiology, has a latent stage and an active stage. For 6 years you've been running in the latent stage. We designed it that way. We were managing the timeline." She paused. "The Skraith station engagement. The soldier who spoke to you." He went very still. "The phrasing was deliberate," she continued. "Specific phonemic combinations in standard that function as a biological trigger. We identified the trigger sequence years ago and have been maintaining surveillance to prevent any Skraith operative from getting close enough to use it. At Skraith," she stopped. Looked at her hands. "At Skraith, something went wrong with the containment protocols, and an operative got through, and they spoke 4 words to you." She looked up. "You've been activating since then. The process takes approximately 72 to 96 hours. You're somewhere in the middle of it. The maintenance codes, the navigation instincts, the tones from the Skraith ship, resolving into meaning in a language he had never been trained to understand." "What does it do?" he said. His voice was very controlled. He was aware of controlling it very precisely. "The full activation. What does it change?" Marin Voss was a scientist, which meant she explained things in the order she considered correct rather than the order that would have been emotionally merciful, and so she began not with the answer but with the mechanism, which was itself a kind of answer. The Skraith contribution to his physiology was not merely structural, not merely the physical modifications that let him operate in their environments and pass at distance as something not quite human. It was cognitive. It was perceptual. It was, in the deepest available sense, experiential. The Skraith had a second cognitive mode, a way of processing reality that human neuroscience had no framework for and had only identified by observing its effects, in Skraith captives, in Skraith behavior patterns during combat, in the specific and peculiar way they navigated and communicated and made decisions. It was not intelligence exactly, not in any way that mapped onto human intelligence, but it was something that operated in parallel with intelligence and produced a being that perceived certain things, spatial relationships, biological signals, strategic geometries, at a resolution that human cognition simply could not reach. It was why they were so difficult to fight. Not strength, not speed, not technology. Resolution. They saw the shape of things more clearly than their opponents. That capacity was in him. Had always been in him, latent, contributing in muted form to the abilities he had spent 6 years calling training and instinct. In full activation, it would come online completely. He would not become Skraith. His primary cognitive architecture was human, would remain human, but he would perceive the way they perceived, think across both modes simultaneously, exist in a category that neither species had a word for because neither species had previously produced one. "What the soldier said," he said, during a pause in her explanation. "We made you first. What does that mean?" She looked at him for a long moment that told him everything before she spoke. "It means the project was not initiated by us," she said. "The Skraith brought us the genetic modification framework. They had been developing it for, we don't know how long. They offered it to human military science through a covert channel, early in the war, at a moment when the war was going badly for both sides and certain factions on both sides were looking for alternative solutions." She said this carefully, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. The framework called for a hybrid. A being that could function in both cognitive modes. They said it could be a mediator. A translator. Something that could navigate between the species and potentially find an end to the conflict that neither side could negotiate to on its own. "That's not what I've been doing for 6 years," Axon said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." When the human military took possession of the framework, they reinterpreted it. The mediation architecture became an infiltration tool. The bridge became a weapon. She met his eyes and held them. "You were designed to end the war. You have been used to continue it. That is what the file says. That is what you came here to read." "Factions," he said. "You said factions on both sides." The soldier at Skraith was a Skraith intelligence operative. "Are there Skraith who want what the original framework promised?" "Yes," she said. "And they've been trying to reach you for some time." He thought of the ship in the Veritas scatter. Motionless. Waiting. Signaling in a frequency that had resolved itself in his newly activating processing into "we know where you're going and we want the same thing." "How long have we been talking?" he said. She checked the time. 14 minutes. "My pursuers from Skraith will have been coordinating. They'll have calculated possible trajectories and destinations and weighted Veritech Station as a primary candidate. We have..." He ran the numbers with a speed that was not the speed he would have achieved 24 hours ago. 40 minutes before a fast intercept vessel could reach this position if they dispatched immediately on departure from the scatter. She nodded slowly. "My files," he said. "Where?" She walked him through the station. The younger researcher, whose name was Fawn, he never said more than 6 words in sequence, followed 3 paces behind with the air of someone attending an event they were professionally obligated to witness. They moved through the main research corridor, past doors that Axon read as significant without understanding fully why, past a room that smelled of something that triggered a response in him that was below language and above feeling, a response that he noted and did not pursue because there was not time, and into the station's central processing core. The core was a circular room. Information architecture of the old school, physical terminals, hardwired connections, a data storage system isolated from any external network by deliberate design. Everything that lived here lived only here. It could not be accessed remotely. You had to arrive in person, in the specific room, in the specific station, at the specific coordinates that the navigation charts called a footnote. He had arrived. There was one terminal that was different from the others. It was positioned at the room center rather than its circumference, freestanding, with a form factor that he recognized not from any technology he had been issued or trained on but from somewhere older. It looked like something he had seen before in a place he could not name. He walked to it without being guided. "Ocular scan," Marin Voss said from behind him. "The file is keyed to your biometrics. No one else can open it. It was designed that way from the beginning. The information belongs only to the person it concerns." He looked at the scanner. The scanner looked back. Somewhere in the station systems, a recognition occurred that was not simply technology acknowledging technology, but something more reciprocal, more strange. As if the file had been waiting for the specific configuration of him that stood here now, activated, awake in a new way, capable of receiving what it contained. The terminal chimed softly. His file opened. Before the reading, there was a moment that he would not have had access to yesterday, a moment that only existed for him because the activation had progressed far enough that he could perceive what he perceived. The biological signatures of the 2 researchers behind him, the particular patterns of their breathing, the electrical activity that read to him now as emotion, as anticipation, as something in Marin Voss that he would have identified, in the Skraith mode he was learning to use, as grief. Long-carried grief. The kind that has lived in a body for so long it becomes structural. She had made him. That was what the grief said, in the language of biological signals. Whatever the file contained, she had made him, and she had watched what he was made for become something else, and the grief was the accumulated weight of that watching. He noted it. He turned to the terminal. The file was long. It was organized in the formal structure of classified military documentation, sections and subsections and indices that imposed bureaucratic order on what was, at its heart, the story of a life assembled by committee, by negotiation, by the competing interests of two species in a war that neither fully understood how to end. There were dates. There were names. There were technical specifications that described him the way an engineer describes a structure, in the language of load and tolerance and design function. He read the first section and something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in stories when the revelation is written for maximum impact. It was a smaller change, more interior than exterior, the kind of change that registers in the muscles around the eyes and the angle of the jaw and the specific way a person holds their breath without deciding to hold it. His eyes moved across the text and something shifted in them. Not the expression a person wears, but the thing behind the expression, the thing that expressions are built to communicate and frequently fail to. He read the second section and stopped. Stood with his eyes on the screen. Thun, who had been watching from the room's perimeter, looked at Marin Voss. She shook her head slightly. They were quiet. The station was quiet. Somewhere in the outer structure, a system cycled through its automated maintenance routine, and the sound of it moved through the walls and dissipated. 40 light-years from the nearest human population center, a room was very still. Axon read the third section. His left hand, hanging at his side, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. It was not aggression. It was the physical response of a body receiving information that the mind has not yet fully processed and is trying to metabolize through movement. His breathing had changed, slower, deliberate, the controlled breathing of someone applying what they know about their own physiology to manage what they're experiencing, and managing it and continuing. He read the fourth section and made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they have suspected and something they have feared and something they have hoped, all three of which are incompatible, resolve simultaneously into a single truth that contains all of them and transforms each of them in the process. A short sound. Not repeated. Marin Voss looked at the floor. He read the fifth section, and the change in his face completed itself into something that was not anger, and was not grief, and was not relief, and was not any single thing, but was instead the face of a person who has been handed a mirror in which they finally appear. Not the mirror of vanity or self-assessment. The mirror that shows you what you are when no one is watching, when all the chosen presentations have been removed. The mirror of original fact. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He stood with wet eyes and read the sixth section with the same thoroughness he had brought to the first, and in his face, alongside the unnamed complexity of the revelation, there was something that was beginning, carefully and without fanfare, to organize itself into what might eventually become purpose. Not the assigned purpose he had operated under for 6 years, the purpose that had been built into him by people with competing interests and strategic agendas. Something else. Something that the file had apparently articulated, in whatever words it used, and that he was now holding in the changed architecture of his processing, turning over, considering. Somewhere in the station's outer hull, a proximity alarm sounded. Distant, one tone, the first alert of an approaching vessel. 40 minutes, he had calculated, and he had been in this room for 38. He did not close the file. He read the last section. He read the final paragraph, which was shorter than the others, and his face held its changed configuration and did not change further, as if it had arrived at the thing it had been traveling toward and had no further direction to travel. He reached out and closed the file himself. He turned from the terminal. Marin Voss looked at him and said nothing. She was waiting for him to speak, but she was not rushing it, and he recognized in that patience a long habit of care, a person who has learned over many years that certain moments require the silence they require and that filling them is an act of cowardice dressed as helpfulness. He thought about what to say. He thought about the Skraith ship in the scatter, waiting with its message of convergent purpose. He thought about two species in a war that had been running long enough to become its own reason. He thought about what it meant to be a bridge that had been used as a weapon and what it would take to be what you were designed to be in a universe that had already decided to use you otherwise. He thought about activation, about the new mode of processing he could feel running in parallel now, the Skraith clarity of perception that let him see the geometry of things with a resolution he had never before had access to, and what it might be possible to see, from that position, that neither side could see from their own. The proximity alarm sounded again, 2 tones now, closer. He looked at Marin Voss and then looked at Fawn, who had not, in all this time, put down his tablet. Then he looked at the door. Whatever his face showed in that moment, the face that had changed in front of a terminal in a room in a station at the edge of navigated space, it showed it completely, without management, without the professional calibration of 6 years of military identity. It was the face of someone who knows, at last, what they are. And what they are, and what they were built to be, and what the file said in its final paragraph that neither Marin Voss nor Fawn nor anyone pursuing him across hostile space would ever read. All of that lived in that face like light in a room that has just been opened. He walked through the door. The story does not follow him.